photos with us and videos of the historic ice yachts. And you plan to include some home movies of Crumwold Hall and the Rogers family ice boating off Rogers Point. So this kind of sticks with everybody in town. And he'll give us some tales of races for 30-foot silk pennants and silver cups and the skippers of these unique racing ice yachts. So thank you. Let's welcome Brian. Thank you.
Is it working? Tony? Audio working?
Try it.
Yeah, I think I should. People can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, well, glad to be here. Hopefully the audio's enough. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
We're okay, right? Okay. Glad to be here. I've done a lot of talks on ice boating, and I feel kind of really extra special being in Hyde Park. Don't ask me why. There's something about Hyde Park and ice boating, and maybe somebody. Anybody been out on an ice boat here? That's in the audience. A handful of you. Okay. So this is gonna. Oops. This way. We're kind of. We had a little technical difficulty, so we're really going to try to make sure that we don't get any glitches here. So I've been, what is this ice boat? So tonight I'm going to cover, the history of ice boats here in the Hudson Valley and their prominence and kind of the origins of this idea of ice yachting. Really, the Hudson River is where it all kind of began and spread. So I've been kind of just fascinated with them since I took my first ride in 1990 down in the Hudson River in Rhinecliff. A friend of mine in Red Hook said, come on down, we have these ice boats. And I grew up in Red Hook and didn't know what they were at all, never heard of them, but it went down, got some rides, got a ride with a Hyde Park resident. Some of you may remember Tom Gilbert gave me a ride in his boat, and then from that day on I was just kind of hooked. And not only just sailing the boats, but for whatever reason, I just got fascinated with the deep dive and the history and who the sailors are. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to try to go over tonight. And I'll try to have you out of here by 11:30. I did this talk about 3 weeks ago, and I got rid of a bunch of slides that I was pertaining to that, and I kept putting more and more and more into this. And it's growing, it's hard to eliminate stuff. So feel free to jump in, ask questions, stop me anytime if you're wondering about anything. But so what are these things, these ice yachts? And what I'm talking about here are these, what I call the historic gaff-rigged stern steering boats. They're basically, it's a sailboat that goes on ice. And they are gaff rigged, which means that main sail to the back is four-sided. It's got a gaff up top. It's got a jib in the front. It's called a sloop rig. These beautifully wooden crafted vessels that run on 3 iron skates. And we'll be looking at the old historic ones, who some of the well-known skippers were and the races that took place, and bring that into the today. And those boats that were from back in that time that are still sailing today. So I always like this slide. It's one of the only slides I know where the dog is getting on a ride out there. You see the dog in the cockpit. So yeah, so these are some of the same historic boats that go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, that are still sailing today. And again, those gaff rig. Stern steering means it's steered from the back with a rudder, like a sailboat's rudder in the water. So what is an ice boat? There's some pieces of the backbone which is going fore and aft, a big stick of wood. This boat's about 30 foot long. It's got a runner plank that is perpendicular to that backbone, and on the end of the runner plank, we're seeing one of the 2 runners that glides on cast iron running shoes, skate, if you will, and sharpened to a fine point, and it glides over the ice. There's a cockpit for the captain and passengers. View of the cockpit from a different angle. There's the old boat. Many of the old boats have these beautiful horsehair cushions with velvet coverings or corduroy coverings, and it's got a big iron tiller there that's turning the rudder true. And there you can see that rudder in the back, the tiller. And in this case, there's a couple that are racing the boat. So you got a skipper that's on the tiller and a crewman who's in this case, working the sheets, which is adjusting the sail for maximum efficiency and speed in the boats. And speed is a big part of ice boating. They go fast. they can go 20, 30, 40 miles an hour, 50, 60 miles an hour. And you get a gust of wind and your boat might go into a height there where suddenly it feels like you're flying. There's so little resistance between the three runners on the ice that the speed can get quite, you can go to 2 to 3 times the speed of the wind, which, you know, the hull of the sailboat is a lot of drag on it, but very little drag on the 3 fine points of the runners on these boats. This actually is not the best point to sail when you're up like that. It's not good for speed, but it can be pretty thrilling to see these boats. And yes, you know, there's reports where they would race the trains back in the day, and reports of boats getting up to 100 miles an hour on some runs down the ice, down the Hudson River. So it wasn't unusual that back in those days the boats would race the Chicago Express coming from Poughkeepsie down to New Hamburg and get there before the train got down to New Hamburg Station. So, and what are some of the origins of these ice boats? Well, as far as we know, and there's some old woodcuts that the Dutch in Holland back in the 1600s were the first to kind of experiment, as far as we know, with taking their summer boats, kind of putting a plank underneath the hull with some sort of iron shoe, and putting a sort of an iron shoe of sorts under their rudder in the back of the boat and sailing on the canals and the waterways in Holland back in the 1600s. There's several wood cuttings that prints that show these boats in Holland in those days. And the Dutch brought some of those ideas here to the Hudson Valley as they settled here. And as I looked at back in time, it seems like anywhere there's ice in northern climes, people are trying to figure out a way to move along that ice. So, you know, I think I've read accounts of people trying variations of ice boating. What did that mean for them? Who knows what? But some sort of boat with some sort of runner shoe and maybe a sail, getting them moving along. Some of the earliest reports on the Hudson River, and there's different accounts, but sometimes I've heard in 1819, 1820, 1833 of a family in Poughkeepsie called the Southwicks, 2 brothers that were out sailing on the Hudson off the Poughkeepsie docks there on their crude ice boat. And so there was definitely a smattering of ice boating happening off Poughkeepsie, a little experimentation. The first kind of real written account of it was actually up in Athens, here across from Hudson. And in 1821, there was some of the steamboat captains or the ship sloop captains in the winter were experimenting with these contraptions on ice. And there's an account that was in the Catskill papers, but also in other places around the country. I've seen it. You know, it was reported around in Philadelphia, Albany, that they made the run from Athens up to Albany in less than an hour. This is 1821. Triangular shaped craft with a sloop sail, a main and a jib, and took up to 10 people on board there. So there's a lot of experimentation going on upriver from Poughkeepsie, upriver from Hyde Park up in Athens, and there are more accounts of them building boats and trying that, and also accounts of some gentlemen from Poughkeepsie heading up there and checking these things out. Also, they had known about the Southwood brothers sailing off of Poughkeepsie, and they went to check them out and brought a couple of those boats from Athens down to Poughkeepsie and began tweaking them and working on them themselves. So by 1860, there was a fleet of at least a dozen ice boats sailing off the waterfront in Poughkeepsie. So this is an article I just kind of transcribed it from the Poughkeepsie Daily Eagle in late 1860 there. The reporters writing, exploring the river, we took a stroll yesterday to the river partly to enjoy the fine bracing atmosphere and to make a note of anything interesting. And it goes on to talk about the hundreds of people ice skating out on the river. But then it goes on to say, but perhaps the most important feature of winter's enjoyment is the great penchant for ice boats. And we have collected as near as possible an account of these crafts and give the result of our labors below. And they have a listing of over a dozen ice boats that were on the ice and their owners. And some names you might recognize there. You've got Edward Innes, he was the mayor of Poughkeepsie. John G. Vassar was out ice boating. Collingwood of the Collingwood Opera House in the day. Oliver Booth, who actually worked at the Vassar Brewing Company. John Roosevelt, and they were out there with their different ice boats. And the article says, we challenge any city in this country to produce a fleet of ice boats that will compare in size, beauty, and speed with the Poughkeepsie fleet. So by the 1860s, off in the winters off the waterfront, you could probably see a scene of a a bunch of boats out there, taking people for rides, having little races, and within a year, the Poughkeepsie Ice Yacht Club was founded in 1861, and the Commodore of that club was Oliver Booth at that time in the 1860s. And what were these boats like? Well, here's an old photo. It's probably one of the older photos I've seen of an ice yacht. They're wooden affairs, triangular in shape. It's a little tricky. If you notice, the mast is where it's stepped. The mast is put up right over the runner plank, where the runner plank and the backbone going forward and aft intersect. It's got heavy wooden railings on it for stability, and had a big long boom that stretched out over the back of the boat, and a huge jib. There's a boat called the Vesper. Here's another example. Aramis, it's Hayes. Again, heavy wooden timbers, and they went pretty fast. A little unstable. Well, that sail area in that boat, even with the weight, they did have a tendency to flicker and spin around and get out of control at times, which added for some thrilling sails. Here's another kind of newspaper clipping of the Hayes. You kind of see the big heavy timbers there that are helping fashion that together. Again, your fore and aft backbone and your plank and your three runners there. And by those 1860s, the local papers were reporting on all the ice yachting going on there, including a famous run from Poughkeepsie to Albany by 3 boats from the Poughkeepsie Ice Yacht Club in 1866. They left Poughkeepsie, went up, stopped in Rhinecliff, up in Athens, Hudson, and eventually got up to Albany within a day and stayed at the Beaverwood Club up there. And the next day they sailed back to Poughkeepsie. Though one of the boats broke down, they got taken back on a train at that point. But this was written up in papers all around the country about this great expedition. One of the big players in the Poughkeepsie Ice Yacht Club was John A. Roosevelt. This is FDR's uncle, John Aspinwall Roosevelt. In 1960, he was 21 years old, and he was actually one of those gentlemen that had gone from Poughkeepsie up to Athens in the 1850s and bought one of the boats up there so that they had been building up around Athens, were experimenting with it. He brought it back to Poughkeepsie, did some modifications to it, and his boat was called the Icicle. And here's an early sketching of his boat, Icicle. He had a series of boats called Icicle, and was constantly upgrading them, making them bigger, trying to get the fastest boat possible, and it culminated in probably the largest ice yacht ever built. This is John Roosevelt's Icicle, built probably late 1870s. It's 68 foot long. It's 1,070 square foot of sail. These things were huge and heavy. Of course, luckily he had a whole crew on his estate to help him set up his boat. I don't know how they got that thing put together, but so the idea of bigger is faster, big sail area, big winds, you're going to win the races. And racing was a really big part of the ice boating. So by this time there was many ice boats. The wealthy families in the Poughkeepsie area up in the Hyde Park. Another picture of Icicle. And who was building these boats? Well, there was a man named Jacob Buckout. Jacob Buckout in Poughkeepsie had a shop there. He was building, by this point in the 1860s, 1870s, he was building all the ice yachts for the wealthy sportsmen of the Hudson Valley. He grew up across the river. He was a cooper by trade originally. He took a whaling ship out of New Bedford back in the 1850s and spent 3 years on a whaling ship, learning all about woodworking, and probably did everything on that. Came back and set up a boat shop over in Milton across the river, and eventually set up a shop in Poughkeepsie where he built boats for the river in summertime, different types of boats, and but his big demand to build ice boats for these people, and built all of John Roosevelt's boats. And here's a scene from Roosevelt Point. John Roosevelt lived in Rosedale, which is just into Poughkeepsie, just past the Hyde Park border into Poughkeepsie. His house is still there. His boathouse was down in the river, right where, I'm going to forget again, I always forget the restaurant that burned.
Brass Anchor.
Brass Anchor, right. So right next to the Brass Anchor was John Roosevelt's old ice boat house, where he kept his boats and many of the club boats in that house. Unfortunately, that's gone now. A couple other boats today there. Again, and this was that style from the 1860s, 1870s. Well, Poughkeepsie that area was not the only place. Well, hold on a second here. And again, a lot of coverage by magazines and photographs making these prints of real lively scenes on the ice. Crowds would come down and get rides or watch the races. Some more great prints back in the day. Well, Poughkeepsie wasn't the only area where ice boating was taking off. Down in New Hamburg, this man, Irving Grinnell, founded the New Hamburg Ice Yacht Club in 1869. Grinnell was kind of just a wealthy country gentleman. He was the grandnephew of Washington Irving. His estate was down where Bowden Park is now in that area. And he was an active member of the New York Yacht Club as well. So in the summer, he was kind of part of the the vice commodore of the New York Yacht Club, so very into racing, and he built many ice boats himself and raced ice boats. Would go from New Hamburg up to Poughkeepsie to race against the Poughkeepsie sailors. And he, in 1875, commissioned Jacob Buckout to build what was deemed one of the finest ice yacht ever built. Built specifically for the 1876 the Centennial in Philadelphia. It was a boat called a Whiff. And it had a carved griffin on the bowsprit there, and the finest Egyptian cotton sails, and nickel-plated hardware, and the finest, woods. And he did indeed display it at the Centennial. There is the Centennial Hall on display in full glory. And that was said that was the first place a lot of Americans ever saw an ice boat. They came from different places and took that idea back to their places where there was ice, particularly in the Midwest. Started building ice boats in places in Madison, Wisconsin, for instance, and up in New England lakes. And there's Grinnell on the Whiff, sometime late, about 1880 or so. But being a competitive racer, he decided, well, ice boating needs its kind of version of America's Cup that he was familiar with in the summer racing. So he came up with this idea of creating what's called the Ice Yacht Challenge Pennant of America. And there are all kinds of racing going on for silver cups and for fur coats and for a silver tiller and cigar boxes and things like that between the members of the Poughkeepsie Ice Yacht Club. So he presented in 1875 or so that we should have this challenge pennant that will be the thing to race for show you the fastest yacht for supremacy on the ice. And it was a 30-foot silk pennant. With the letters Ice Yacht Challenge Pennant of America that was created to be that thing to race for. So immediately different clubs started challenging. So the Poughkeepsie Club challenged the New Hamburg Ice Yacht Club to race. And it took a couple of years, and finally in 1881 they had the first race for them. This is actually not a picture from that race, but a couple of these boats were in there at that time. But that's kind of what the scene might have looked like somewhat at the beginning of that race. So in March of 1881, they had the race, and it was won by a boat from the New Hamburg Ice Yacht Club called the Phantom. And actually, that's the actual medal that the Phantom received for winning that race. It's when members of our club have possession of that there. And so they got their silver medal there, and they got to fly the pennant from the top of their mast. For there. So this became a big item for the sailors to race for, and it got raced for many times over the next 20 years. Got a little side thing here about that same time, around 1881, this ship captain from Athens came down on a new boat he designed with Jacob Buckout together. And it was a boat he called the Robert Scott, and he made some significant design changes in this boat. So he reduced the sail area, he moved his mast forward. These are little technical things. Moved the mast forward so the boat had better balance. He used wire rigging for stability rather than those big heavy timbers. And so the boat, in some ways, a little lighter weight, a little more streamlined, and much better balance. It could go upwind and downwind a little better, and he immediately started beating all the bigger boats, including John Roosevelt with his icicle, which is almost twice the sail area of that. So everybody was really fascinated with this new design, and they went back to Jacob Buckout and said, I want my boat to be rebuilt like Relier's Robert Scott. So they all kind of trashed their old boats and all began building their boats on what was called the Scott design. So Aaron Innes took his haze, and he moved the mast forward, got rid of the big heavy timbers, but wires. He still has that huge main there. John Roosevelt got rid of his big icicle and he built a boat that's more like 50 foot long here and 750 square foot of sail, but again, using that wire riggings, and his boat he found it was much, much faster. Around that same time, another skipper came along, another person very connected with the America's Cup, Archibald Rogers, who had somewhere around the late, got involved in 1880 was the first time he kind of got involved. Had Buckout build him a boat. Like I said, he was also very involved in the America's Cup. He had several boats that he was campaigning to get into the Cup. And his boats never quite won, so he never raced actually in the America's Cup, but he was in some of the trial runs for that. His boat, the Colonia, was one of his boats. Another one's called the Wasp. But that was his summertime. But in the winter, he was very, passionate and active ice boater. So this boat was called the Jack Frost, and about the size of the icicle we saw there. And he immediately started racing, and he won the Challenge Pennant of America several times in those 1880 years. And about mid-1885, there was a little dispute in one of the races, and a lot of people left the Poughkeepsie Ice Yacht Club, and they joined and reformed a new club called the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club. So in 1885, they formed that, and John Roosevelt became Commodore. So a lot of the club members left Poughkeepsie, and not that they had to go anywhere, they just joined a new club. They had a new clubhouse or whatever, but some hard feelings over a race, and over the next bunch of years, the Poughkeepsie Ice Yacht Club died out, and the real main club was the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club with Roosevelt the Commodore. And again, they continued to race for that Challenge Pennant of America. Some of the different lineups in those races. Sorry for blocking your view here. Again, big coverage in all the local papers. New York Times would always cover any of the races. They talk about the upcoming race and what boats might be sailing, and here they're talking about this boat, the Avalanche, which won, and this was, I think, the first race that Jack Frost was in with Archie Rogers. They came in second against the Avalanche this year in 1883. Jack Frost did win the pennant in 1887. That's kind of the beginning lineup of it. And there's thanks to several people here, discovered some old glass lantern slides at the Historical Society, which are there in the museum. So a couple of these shots are actually digital images of those glass slides. So they had some all on ice boating, so it's pretty cool. So there's a bunch of ones in here. There's one showing the start of a race. That was another one. This is off of Rogers Point a little later. You get a sense of how big these boats yet still were. So that's the Northern Light. J.C. Barron was a yachtsman from New York City who came up and racing for the pennant, won at 85. And there's Northern Light down at off the Poughkeepsie waterfront. It's called Rock there, and coming down and going around the Mark and heading back up where they usually would start up a little north of Roosevelt Point, come down to Poughkeepsie and go up. There's usually a 10-mile race downriver, back upriver, downwind and upwind for a 20-mile race total. And thousands of people would come out on the ice or on the shore to watch these boats race against each other. So here's a couple of the owners of the boats, kind of the wealthy yachtsmen, landowners of the day. Some went estates along the Hudson, some were from New York. So there's four of them. All had different competitive ice yachts, and none more than John Roosevelt there on the far right. But I always like the next shot, which is on the guys who actually really sailed boats. These were the owners who had the boats. Like I think they hired a crew that really knew what they were doing to race their boats. Now, John Roosevelt would race his boats at times, but typically Willie Smith on the right was his main skipper. Gibson and Scott were also a skipper for other boats that were racing in these races. So one thing Archie Rogers always did race his Jack Frost. He didn't give it up to somebody else. So he was one of the few owners who was actually still skippering his own boat. So all during this time, they're experimenting with rigs. We talked about it, talked real briefly. It gets a little technical. I don't want to bore you down about that Scout motto, adjusting the mast. Well, in the 1880s, this idea of a lateen rig came along, which was the shear poles. It's kind of hard to see. It's like an A-frame of shear poles. It suspends a one big piece of canvas between a triangular piece. And it became, in different parts of the country, this lateen idea was a faster way to race boats. So this is the boat Avalanche, which had been sloop rigged, and he had Buckout create a lateen rig for him. This is a...
Can I ask you, what does lateen rig mean?
Lateen is it's a style of a sailboat. It's a style of a sail that it's actually based on in the Egyptian dhows, a style of sail plan is really what it's about. So lateen is it's got instead of a single mast, it's got a set of, they call them shear poles, almost like legs that are in a triangular fashion. You can't see the leg going down the other side. We'll see another picture in a minute. But so, and again, just one big sail and. Oh gosh, what's the guy's name? Give me a second here. Sanford, E. Harrison Sanford had his Avalanche. He was convinced that this was the best style to go. So he finally had a chance to take it out in a good wind and nice ice, and just to prove what a great sailor was. And the boat became totally unresponsive and threw him out of the boat as he spun out of control. And he said, "That's it, forget it." And he had Buckout make his boat back into the sloop rig. These people had that kind of money that was going around. So, and he did. This actually went in the sloop rig before the lateen, but here's another picture of the Avalanche. And he did win the challenge pennant one year. And there's, but there was, while his wasn't, maybe it was too big, maybe he wasn't quite the right sailor for it, but there was several successful lateen rig boats, and this might give you a little better picture of what that, with that kind of A-frame. So in 1885, a couple of brothers, Charlie Marin, Bill Marin from down in Low Point down in Chelsea, it was called Carthage Landing at the time, were experimenting. They built a smaller lateen rig boat called the Eugene. And they sailed up to Poughkeepsie and did some kind of scrub races with some of the big boats there and beat several of them pretty handily, including John Roosevelt. Probably not his big icicle, but on some of his smaller boats. But so John Roosevelt bought it on the spot that day after seeing how the boat performed, changed his name to Vixen, and it became one of his favorite small boats to sail around from 1885 on, when he wasn't sailing his big icicle in the races. So. Archie Rogers experimented with that style for a while. It was one of his favorite boats called Ariel. He re-rigged it as a lateen, but didn't seem to like it. He got rid of that after a while. That's down at Rogers Boathouse there. Well, there's other parts of the country that had ice yacht clubs too. It wasn't just on the Hudson. And one big place south of us, and on the Shrewsbury River in Red Bank, New Jersey, there was a group of sailors and boat builders and captains in the summer were also building and racing ice boats. So the North Shrewsbury Ice Yacht and Boat Club was formed in early 1880s, and they of course heard about the Challenge Pennant of America, and they challenged the Hudson River Club many times for that pennant. And they brought their boats up to the Hudson River down from Red Bank, New Jersey to sail for that pennant. And their big boat was called the Scud. It was lateen rigged, and they felt that was their fastest boat in their fleet. And they brought that boat up time, and often it just stayed up here as they waited for the following winter. So they would race for that. They never won the Challenge Pennant from the Hudson River Club, the Scud, nor the Dreadnought, which was the other boat that the Shrewsbury group would bring up here to race. They tried to get it again. So it was a real friendly rivalry between the Red Bank Jersey sailors and the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club sailors. And the last time they raced was in February of 1902. That's the Scud and the Dreadnought from Jersey, and the Jack Frost and the Icicle, racing for the Challenge Pennant. The Jack Frost won this year. And that was the last time these big boats really sailed for that pennant. And during that race, the Scud had an unfortunate mission visit. Found a hole in the river and went over. That took them out of the race.
Can I ask a question about the ice? How deep does the ice have to be before you can put boats out of the river?
It's probably like to have 10 inches or more. You know, in the river it's sort of tricky with the currents and such. It depends on the part of the river, maybe even more than, especially that they wouldn't put these big boats out unless, I don't really know what they're, probably even a little more than that, because these boats are really, really heavy. So Nowadays, we're not sailing the boats quite so large, and yeah, but still, and we'll go out and check punch holes in the ice, get our little rulers measure and over a whole area before we decide to put boats out. So that's good. Well, there's still even other places where people were sailing outside of Newburgh, a little lake called Orange Lake, and there was a group of sailors there as well. The Orange Lake Ice Yacht Club was organized in 1888, and they had a naval architect named Percy Ashley who was designing and building boats out there, and they were also competitive racers. And it's a slightly higher elevation in a shallow lake, and they claimed they had ice at the beginning of December, which went through the end of March, and they were always inviting the Hudson River folks up there. Said, we got ice earlier, why don't you come on up here? They tried to race at the challenge pennant a couple times, never won, but after a while they got a little kind of annoyed. They felt the regulations around racing for that challenge pennant were a little unwieldy, and they kind of felt, well, come on up here, we got ice. A lot of times they couldn't race because the Hudson River just wasn't in good enough condition to race. And there's a lot of tit for tat going back in the newspapers were reporting on this. And then in 1889, one of their members, Gardner Van Nostrum, decided, well, we're going to make an ice yacht cup to race for, to be the fastest boat in the world. So it's this Gardner Van Nostrum's Ice Yacht Challenge Cup of America. So Tiffany's made this for him. It's this unbelievable silver cup with a bas relief with the carvings of the Orange Lake Ice Yacht Clubhouse, an ice boat on it, and these beautiful engravings on it. So they put it up. The river people say, what are you talking about? You can't decide that there's going to be another cup that's the cup. We've already got it. It's called the Challenge Pennant of America. We've been racing for it for over 10 years, a dozen times. And you don't just suddenly say, we're going to have this to be the cup. Not America's Cup doesn't count anymore. It's going to be this. So it was interesting to see the accusations flying back and all the newspapers reporting on this. Well, the Hudson River people didn't take them up on it. They didn't put much stock in it. So they say, well, we've got to spend it. You want to race? Come down and race us on the river. So, well, the Hudson folks never raced for it, but guess who did come up? The Red Bank people who weren't winning for the pennant. So they brought their boats scud up to Orange Lake in 1891, and they beat the Orange Lake boats, and they took that silver cup home with them to New Jersey. So, great story. So there was a fleet of 6 boats racing that day. It was a really good day. The scud prevailed there. So that cup went down to Jersey. There was a couple other attempts to race for it, but it kind of disappeared after that. Not much was known about it for quite a long while. Get back to it. Well, in 1899, things were shifting a little bit. They were keeping the ferry track open in Poughkeepsie, between Poughkeepsie and Highlands. It was a little harder to sail south out of Roosevelt Point south. So a lot of the action moved up north, and Archie Rogers had a big fleet of boats at his place in Rogers Point there. So they started the Hyde Park Ice Yacht Club in 1899. And it's a Jack Frost right there in the middle. There's also a couple different boathouses where they raced from or stored boats. One was at the Barred Rock Boathouse off near the Vanderbilt estate, and Archie Rogers, his boathouse was at Rogers Point. There were still members of the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club, very active, as well as the Hyde Park Club, and a lot of them were members of both clubs. So they kind of have races against each other. But a lot of them, like I said, the action shifted up north here a little more, so a lot more sailing up to Sopus Island down to Rogers Point. A lot of activity in the first decade of the 1900s here, several of the Allons and the Bessie racing. FDR's neighbor, Thomas Newbold, was an active ice boater also. He was actually at the Commodore of the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club in 1908. That's his boat in Nansen that Jacob Buckout built for him. Actually, Jacob Buckout by that point had died, and his son, George Buckout, took over the business, and his son, George Buckout, began building incredible ice yachts also. There were great festive days there. A lot of great just fun sailing and racing going on. This is a little article about. One of the prettiest sights of the season was witnessed at Hyde Park Saturday when all the ice yachts of the Hyde Park Ice Yacht Club were on the river and several races were pulled off. A large number of Vassar students, chaperoned by Professor Gao, skated from Poughkeepsie to Hyde Park, and another delegation went up by train. The students wore sweaters and toboggan caps, and the sight, blending with the flutter of the white sails of the ice yachts and the crowds on the ice, made a picture not soon to be forgotten. So,
Chaperone. I love the word chaperoned.
several accounts of the Vassar students coming up and sailing with the ice sailors there. Again, the papers covered all the events. In February, both Archie Rogers was sailing his boat, Ariel. They went into a hole in the river, and he and his wife were tossed in there, and they were rescued. This was covered in papers all around the country of the time. So that's his boat, Ariel, that he had sailed into a hole. Here's a little boat called, I want to put this in your cyclone, which is built on the Crumwold estate there by Charles Van Lown, and that's Archie Rogers' youngest son, Herman Livingston Rogers. He's only about 9 years old. They're getting ready to take his little boat out cyclone for a sail. That's the boat I actually own now, so it's kind of it's my connection here. I want to show that. And there's Herman, maybe even a little younger, on another ice boat. I've never seen another picture of that boat, or one that looked like that, but really cool little shot. Give this a try. I have some. These are little snippets of home movies from Crumwold Hall in the winter, which worked fine. I'm not sure if I can get it. Say again? Oh. Okay, maybe I'll try that later on. These about 1903. There was each about a minute long. Them sailing a couple of their ice yachts off of Rogers Point there, see with some of the children and friends and different kind of boats. Sorry, that was a little tricky. We'll have to try that. Maybe towards the end I can try that again. How we doing here? It's 50. Let's put it back here, okay. Yeah, take a moment here to look at this picture. Everybody know what that picture is of? Who's that of? It's the only known picture of.
Is it Roosevelt? Franklin
Yeah,
Roosevelt?
FDR, yeah. That's one picture of himself. In his Uncle John had commissioned George Buck out to build an ice boat for his nephew, FDR, and so his mother presented him with that as his Christmas present in 1901. I'm not sure if it was under the tree when he got it or not. So it's a beautiful lateen rig boat that still exists. It's at the library there. It's actually in storage now. But curiously, I've seen many accounts of that boat sailing, always with different skippers. I've never seen it that actually said that FDR was actually at the helm. It's actually his cousin Ellen Roosevelt, John Roosevelt's daughter, Ellen C. Roosevelt, sailed that probably a whole lot more than he did. She was a real fine ice boater. But anyway, pretty. He was, a champion of ice boaters and preserved a lot of that legacy in his museum later on in the 30s. And he was actually at one point the vice commodore of the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club. Wasn't an officer of the Hyde Park Club, but he was in the Hudson River Club in 1908. And Thomas Newbold, his neighbor, was the commodore then. Well, we're getting into the 1900s, and things slowed down. The races kind of stopped. A lot of the skippers were getting old. John Roosevelt died in 1909. Here's a picture of him in 1902 sailing a little boat called the Brisk, very much like another boat he had called Chris. And he didn't really have anybody to follow up with his yachts. So things kind of quieted down a little bit, but not totally. You know, other interests came around. The automobile was getting the attention of some people. And there was still racing in Hyde Park, and that was probably, you know, pretty much died out in Poughkeepsie a bit. A lot of it still happening in Hyde Park in the second decade of the 1900s, some racing, but things started to kind of slow down, and by the middle of 1914 is the last time I really read a lot about racing and what was happening. Well, the river at times, as it's been said, some parts of it have been kept open by icebreakers, and other times it said it wasn't. The war, World War I came, a lot of people were out, off to war. A lot of the workers, these boats are just also really big. There wasn't as much help to get these boats out on the ice anymore. This is the annual dinner of the Hyde Park Ice Yacht Club in 1914, and their menu there. Oh, that's what I wanted to go. I'm going to have to skip around this. Okay, there we go. So by the 1920s, the Hyde Park Ice Yacht Club was really not meeting anymore. The Hudson River Ice Yacht Club was not meeting anymore, and you know, World War II came. But there's still a couple groups of young men in the area would get the boats out once in a while. But those big boats pretty much stayed up on the Rogers Estate or in John Roosevelt's barn. And but like I said, in 1937 there was a good freeze, and a bunch of boats came out off of Hyde Park Landing. Here's the crew of the. You might have seen this picture before. Tom Gilbert was a young man there. Kunze Todd, Arnold Brower were getting boats out. That's the ice yacht Chris there, which is John Roosevelt's ice yacht, which Arnold Brower acquired somewhere around that time. But so once in a while you get there, a little bit of ice yachting there. It's Tom Gilbert out in his boat Sweet Marie, about that same time, the late 30s. But other than these little pockets, yeah, it kind of really went into a decline there. There wasn't much ice boating. One other place where it was happening a little bit was up in Berrytown at Astor Point, off the Rokeby Estate. The Aldridges had a fleet of ice boats that they'd bring out every once in a while when you had a good freeze on the Hudson. In the mid-30s, what was going on elsewhere, in Detroit, there was a competition to build a small car-toppable ice boat that you could build in your basement. These, the days of these huge ice yachts were kind of really, done by then. So out in the Midwest, they created a boat called the Detroit News, was the plan that kind of won this little contest. A single-seater, about 12 foot long, 60 square foot of sails, called a DN60. And these became very, very popular. A little different, it was bow steering, so that the rudder was in the front, and the body, the weight of the skipper is on the plank on the two runners in the back. So they became very popular, and they were easy to throw them on your car and you go to where the ice is. Another class that developed at the same time was called the Bow Skeeter. It's 75 square foot of sail, again a little bigger. Again, 3 runners, a bow steer, and there was a gentleman in the Hudson Valley here who started building them and racing them. He grew up near Lake Mayapack, and he had seen some of the old ice boats and heard about this new style, this bow skeeter, started building his own. His name was Ray Ruby, and he got into real competitive racing, and he could put his boat on his car and go to where the ice was. So he was racing down in New Jersey at Red Bank. He might go out to Lake Hopatcong, Greenwood Lake, or on the Hudson River if it froze. And he was in different classes based on sail size and design of the boat. So he was a champion for many, many years in the 30s and the 40s, racing his boats. He eventually settled in Cornwall and wrote about ice boating, did entries for the encyclopedia. He wrote for Yachting magazine, and so he was kind of known as the dean of ice boating, as he was very, very knowledgeable. Made friends with some of the old Hudson River skippers who were well into their 70s, particularly one man named Frank Drake, who was from New Hamburg. So he became good friends with Captain Drake, and they rowed litters, and he learned a lot about Frank Drake. And Frank Drake was actually the last person to sail for that Ice Yacht Challenge Pennant of America in 1922, and he won that boat. Well, what happened to that pennant? Well, Ray discovered that Drake still had the pennant, and it had been just kind of forgotten about, one race for over 30 years. So, Ruby was into seeing that put up and raced for again. In 1951, he called the race for the Ice Yacht Challenge Pennant of America, but this time with those new modern boats, those skiers, those bow steers. So Ray raced in it in his charrette, but sailors came from around the country, mainly from the Midwest, and it was actually won by a sailor from the Fox Lake Ice Yacht Club, which is out in Detroit somewhere. And so that pennant went out to the Midwest. That in 1951, it's been out there and raced forever since, and hasn't come back east. So Ray was interested in his history and what's happening. So he also decided he's going to, with a bunch of other people, they revived the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club, which pretty much had been dormant since about 1924. So for 40 years later, in 64, they got the club going again. He got really interested in the old boats, trying to find out what happened to them, where they were. He'd see them here and there, of course, at some of the regattas he went to. And one of the first ones he really wanted to tackle was Archie Rogers' Jack Frost. Well, it had, its backbone had rotted away, and the plank was missing, but he did discover there were some parts around the area. And so he got a bunch of people together that were interested. They got some new lumber, and in 1972, in the basement of Bob Lawrence's house in Newburgh, they rebuilt and restored Archie Rogers' famous Jack Frost, which was the four-time winner of the Ice Yacht Challenge pennant. And so there are, it's maybe new wood, but there are some original parts still on that. And it was launched in 1973 in Orange Lake. So at the time, pretty much still the largest ice yacht sailing, 50-foot long, 750 square foot of sail. And whenever the ice is big enough and strong enough, we get the Jack Frost out as a club when we can. This is a picture from 2003 in Barrytown. They had great ice sailing north of the Kingston Rhinecliff Bridge. And Rick Lawrence from Newburgh, his family, where they rebuilt the boat, he's at the tiller there. And riding there is Nancy Bowen, who was the great-granddaughter of Archie Rogers. She had come up from Virginia with her husband to check out the boat that her father was Edmund Pendleton Rogers, when Archie's son, well, her grandfather was Edmund Pendleton Rogers. So she was thrilled to be able to ride on the boat, and she brought some memorabilia from the Rogers family also. There's Jack Frost on its home ice in Orange Lake. And this is 10 years ago on the Hudson River at Barrytown also, 2014, sailing there. A little after actually before the Jack Frost, he also dug up another old boat called the Puff, which belonged to Irving Grinnell from New York, who put up the challenge pennant. So the Puff was an early boat that Grinnell had, from 1870. They found that, restored that, and now the Puff is up and sailing here in our club too. It's currently our commodore of our club, Emily Hauser. That's the boat she sails now. He also got the Whiff, which had been kind of moved to Mystic Seaport, the Centennial yacht that they displayed in 1876 in Philadelphia. So then the Whiff came back here, was at the Maritime Museum, and now it kind of belongs and is taken care of. But it's a club boat of the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club. So one of the Whiff and the Puff there are the two probably oldest boats still sailing on the river, and that's in Athens, 1999. Actually, going to be setting the Whiff up in Hudson for their winter walk this weekend as a display. One of the things the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club does, when Ray Ruge got reformed in 1964, so we sail the boats, we take people for rides, but also we'll get involved in displays and helping teach about or just tell stories about ice boats and their place in the history here of the Hudson River and Hyde Park and Poughkeepsie. So a bunch of years ago, we were at the Roosevelt estate there and had John Roosevelt's Chris was out, Sweet Marie, Tom Gilbert's boat, and the Hound there, it's a Statsburg boat. So another boat, that boat Vixen, which that lateen rig boat, which was built in 1885, that came up that Roosevelt bought, is still actively sailing. Probably the most longest continually sailed ice yacht, I'd argue, that there is. It was sailed in the Ice Yacht Challenge pennant races a couple times. It went over to Orange Lake and sailed there for many years, and it came back to the Hudson River in the late 60s, and it's been sailed almost every year pretty much that we do get ice. Not that we get it every year. Reid Bielenberg of Germantown sails that boat, Vixen. Owned that cup that disappeared for a while. Well, Ray Ruge was also wondering what happened to that cup. He knew about it through Frank Drake. and did some digging and discovered, well, hey, that cup, they did find it in a vault in Red Bank, New Jersey. That put away. There's a whole lot of other stories about that cup also, but and through a lot of negotiation between the Hudson River Ice Yacht Club and the Red Bank Club, took quite a while. In 1978, we finally got around for challenging them and pulled off a race down in Red Bank, New Jersey for that cup. The Red Bank Sailors won the race, so the cup stayed there. We challenged again in 2003, brought our boats down to the Shrewsbury River. There's a Vixen actually sailing in that race for it. And again, the Red Bank crew won that race. But hey, well, at least there, it's back in action back there. So it's had a long dormancy period. Is, the way those things work, the club with the cup, the Red Bank, they call the shots and they decide. You typically sail on your home ice, or the America's Cup, if Australia has it, you sail for it in Australia, right? So problem is it's getting harder and harder to get good ice there, so it's been trickier to sail down there. And there's also been some discrepancy about what boats to race for. So what did come up, well, there's the cup there, we saw it in 2003, it's still beautiful and gorgeous. And so I talked about the restoration of the frost. Well, the Red Bank crew got really excited knowing our restoration, and they spent over a 20-year period, maybe not quite that much, but they restored one of their famous old yachts called the Rocket, which was built in 1888. It was actually built to race for the Ice Yacht Challenge painter, but it never came up to the Hudson River to sail. It had some problems and its backbone rotted. They rebuilt that and launched it in 2014 in Berrytown. And it sailed for its first time. So these are two boats that are pretty equivalent in size. The Rocket has about 800 square foot of sail, maybe a little more. Jack Frost 750. So one of the Red Bank people put up, not the Tiffany's Cup, but another thing called the Class 1 Ice Yacht Challenge Cup, and for the biggest boats to race for. So, and in the first race, Jack Frost beat the Rocket in 2015. So we did claim that Class 1 challenge thing. So for the big boats, there's a cup, and then smaller size boat, about 350 square foot sail is what we sail for that Tiffany's Cup one, and if that happens. We still challenge for it every year, hoping we get ice. Red Bank's ready to come sail it up on the Hudson River now. If they're still not getting ice down there, it's like we just have to sail for it, otherwise it's no good just sitting there, so we'll see. John Roosevelt's icicle, FDR, of course, I don't know, but they put it in his museum. A bunch of years ago, the museum did the renovation, they wanted it out of there. Just talking to someone who was involved in that area. We removed the Hudson River Club, worked with the museum staff there to help pull that boat out of the museum, set it up, do some inventory, and kind of great to see it's now over at the Hudson River Maritime Museum. So that, and we have this dream of one day getting it. It's pretty complete. A few pieces would need to be fashioned and get a set of sails and get that out racing with Jack Frost again would just be an incredible thing. So we may. And we worked with the Park Service before to help interpret. We set up the FDR's Hawk in the Wallace Center on a couple different occasions for different events, and so we will do some talks with guests, usually in the holiday season, and this, we're hoping that this, it's going to happen this December. We're going to display some boats out. Oh, it's actually inside the Wallace Center. In the Wallace Center. So the Vixen, John Roosevelt's Vixen, and Chris, two Roosevelt boats we're going to put on display over the holidays. But we really like to get out and sail the boats, of course. Whenever we get good ice, it's really a group effort to get out and get those boats set up and sailing and taking people for a ride. It's like, it takes more than a village, but the call goes out and we're all hands on deck. We're helping each other get the boats set up, rigged up. Even though they're not as big as those big icicles and Jack Frost, it still needs a lot of hands to get them and help each other out. And so it's a real community effort, real camaraderie amongst the club and helping each other out. And that's just carrying the mast of the Rocket back to the trailer to take it home.
Mr. Reid, is there any way for the public to know when you're out on the river so we would know when to come back and watch you?
Yeah, there's a couple websites at the end I'll point out, just to remind me, I'll try to at the last slide. Yes. So another thing the club is really involved in is, or when we can, is doing restoration efforts. The Jack Frost from way back, the Puff. And we recently acquired a boat in 2015 called the Manhasset. It was built in Poughkeepsie by George Buckout in 1906. So sailed in Manhasset Bay for many years and then went out to Iowa, of all things. The family bought it and took it out to Iowa in 1946. The Scott family had stayed in touch in these later years with the club and asked us if we wanted it when they were getting old and ready to pass it on. So we acquired the Manhasset and brought it back east, and we're spent a couple years, about a solid year, taking it apart. It had a hollow backbone, so we took the side plates off and stiffened it up and re-glued it and put the Manhasset back together. And last winter we displayed it up in Hudson during their winter walk, which is coming up this weekend. We're displaying different boats. So that's the only double cockpit boat that George Buckout that we know built. So, you know, this idea of kind of displaying and educating about the ice yachts is a big part of our club also. And another thing that's pretty new, pretty exciting news, a lot of boats are average age of, sorry, say, the average age of a lot of skippers is about the average age of this room, believe it or not, right now. Which says, you know, what's going to happen with these boats, you know. And we've, through the efforts of former Commodore Bob Wills, who's here, we've set up what's called the Hudson River Ice Yacht Preservation Trust. We just got our charter from New York State Board of Regents about 2 months ago, and we're trying to find a place where hopefully, it's rather than an old barn with a lot of boats kind of stacked up together, you know, eventually find a place where we can store boats, display boats, work on boats, and hopefully be able to acquire more boats as we need to preserve them. So we also got our 501c3, so we're almost at that point we can start some fundraising. We'll see.
I wanted to tell you just something interesting. We have a big, huge color photograph in my kitchen hanging out. We were up in Barrytown, and it was about 10 years ago, maybe 2014, something like that. And a bunch of people were from, we belong to the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club, the summer yacht club, not the winter one. And a bunch of us were there, and one person took pictures, and I have it framed, hanging every day. And it's just beautiful. They still take people for rides. We just haven't had the ice like now the way it was then.
To piggyback on that, they got small ice boats there for the kids to learn on. And the kids can just take them out. It's just, that's in Cheviot or, you know, Tivoli off of the bay there. And just to watch, the thought that they give the youth the ability to.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
In the photograph, you can see the bridge.
Yeah.
And that was the last big, I'll try to speak a little louder here, we get this last big year for that. So we're kind of excited, we got this new trust to set up to help, so folks not sure what to do with the boats, they can perhaps donate to this trust, but the idea is we want to have the boats sailing. We don't want them to become museum pieces. That's really important, that, you know, they have a place, a safe place to be stored or put on display or do education programs, but also at the same time to, you know, when the ice is there, we'll take them out and sail, which is what we like to do. We like to get out and, you know, that's our favorite thing, of course, is to get out and sail, take people for rides. We race on occasion. We have little races for within our club, Commodore's pennant and things we race for outside of racing against other clubs. And you know, it's just this mission of preserving these boats and sailing them. You know, they were the fastest means of travel on Earth for a long, long time. No fossil fuels, just the wind and the ice and the runners, and you know, trying to preserve that you know, the craftsmanship, the beauty of it, and this wonderful sport. It's Great South Bay many years ago, and it actually froze. You could sail from Belport, Long Island, down to Fire Island. But again, getting the community together, a lot of people gather on the ice when they know the boats are coming out and taking people for rides. That's a cyclone there.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
In our museum, we have a picture or a photograph of the 1912 railroad accident that happened at Rogers Point. And the best view of the train wreck for spectators, or if you want to call them spectators, was some guys got on their ice yachts and went out on the river, and they had an unobstructed view of the train. We'd like to trade maybe some of those pictures for the video that you have of Crumwold. We'd like to do some trading, our museum and your
Yeah,
association.
we'll talk, let's talk, that sounds great, appreciate that, I'd love to see that
And
picture.
another point,
Okay.
when Margaret Marquez was in her 80s, I don't know if it was your yacht or someone in your club, took her for a ride on these ice yachts. I think that was in 1990 something.
1999, Tom Gilbert took her out on his boat up in Athens, I remember that year.
Some of you remember Margaret Marquez, I hope.
Yes.
But back in the day, in the heyday, 1870s, 1880s, how far south could you safely sail as opposed to today? How far south can you safely sail?
It counts, usually there's certain parts of the river where the ice kind of jams up and you can't get by, but Poughkeepsie, they would say Poughkeepsie to Newburgh was where they often sailed, or Newburgh boats came up. I haven't heard of them going further south. There was ice boat clubs in Newburgh, in Chelsea, Carthage Landing. There was, at one point, there was ice boat clubs out in Ossining, near Haverstraw Bay. That's, I know very little about that, so I don't know how long-lived they were, but they generally, the biggest trip I've ever heard was the Poughkeepsie to Albany in 1866. There was not a lot of other accounts of going much further than that. Maybe Poughkeepsie up to Rhine Cliff, but yeah, you couldn't count on getting that consistent ice enough to get by hummocks and cracks, pressure ridges, and things like that would usually foil long distance efforts. So actually Bob did Rhine Cliff to North Germantown in 1990.
1994.
Right, that's one of the longer.
It was 17 miles.
Yeah, that's kind of unusual for now.
I'm Chris, on John Roosevelt's
Yes,
boat.
yes. So this is 2014 in Rugby, but it's a real kind of, I just love the community, the getting together of people, heck, you're out in the middle of the river in January and February, so. And you know why all those boats are set up like that right now, right? Because there's no wind. If there was wind, you wouldn't see it seem like that. All the sails up and just sitting there, so, yeah, there's a big wall there, so, but, if, come on down, there's a little website you can look at in a moment, but, we often have food on the ice. When you have these big gatherings, this was 2014, so this doesn't happen very often, so since then, we've been up in Athens, a couple years, Orange Lake, down in Newburgh a few times, but, that's up near Germantown. One year we were up there. And that's about it. So I have a blog called Hudson River Ice Yachting.blogspot.com. If you want to write that down, take a picture. HRIYC is another website, so sometimes you can get information there if we're out. My website's also called White Wings Black Ice, so if you did a search for White Wings Black Ice, you'd get to that, and I typically will say I have a lot of history about ice boating there, summaries of past years of ice boating, and pictures of old races and things. Some of the images here are from my blog, but I usually will, if we're sailing, I'll eventually put the information down.
There's also the new website, Hudson River Ice Yacht Preservation Trust, so HRIYPT.org.
You want to say that again?
HRIYPT.org.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we have an Instagram, I'm just learning how to do all this stuff. Instagram and Facebook, all that. But Instagram, I post a lot of photos up there. So similar to Brian. Brian's got the history behind it, and mine is a little more current events or things that I find fascinating me that day. I'll post. So
That's pretty much it. Any questions, or happy to, sorry, my videos don't seem to be.
Who owns the north wind?
Reid, that's the North Wind. So it's a boat, that's an orange lake boat that designed by Percy Ashley, so that's, yeah, it's still sailing, so.
Do you know more about the Roosevelt cousin you briefly mentioned? His female cousin who did a lot of the racing. Was that as common? I imagine it was
That was,
mostly a boys' club.
yeah, that was pretty, you're right, that's pretty uncommon. I'm working up to doing a blog, or a whole post about her. So she was kind of fascinating. I've seen it, there's been a handful of things about female sailors in Red Bank, and a couple other places, but one of the Huntington daughters up in Statsburg was also, who might have been dating one of the Astors, was also known for her ice boating daring do. And but yeah, Ellen was, I'm kind of finding her fascinating, so digging up more. So there's a period in the 1902 to 1910 where she was sailing pretty regularly. She was a kind of well-known tennis player of her day also. She and her sister were doubles champs in the early infancy of the tennis thing. So it's I actually got into contact with what would be a great woman who's a great something or other of John Roosevelt. So she has a lot of old Roosevelt images. So it's got a great picture of Ellen sailing an icicle, which I think is pretty amazing.
Was it different for women, like whatever the equivalent of like side saddle would be? Like, do you know if there's like a different expectation, or they were just sailing like the guys?
Yeah, I think just sailing like, yeah, and that's what the newspaper articles would write about, how you know, she was out there as skilled as any of the men. There's curious, I was just watching, some people might remember at Wilderstein, Daisy Suckley, in late 1980s, she went out for an ice boat ride, and they interviewed her about that. So when she was a young girl, she only got to watch. It was maybe because of that Victorian era of her family and stuff, but it wasn't expected that she would be going out on an ice boat at all, or she'd be watching from the porch, and she was talking about that in this interview. But so she had her first ice boat ride when she was something like 93 years old, and sailed on the Vixen on Tivoli Bay. But it was kind of curious to hear her perspective she was excited to do that finally. Got some different pictures here if you want to look. I got an example of a runner, if you want to see a small runner from a small boat, but if you want to see how the kind of the cast iron there is, and there's an example of the ice boat tiller up here. Just I'm happy to answer any questions or otherwise. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. This is our last meeting of the year.
more commonly with small boats where you might have
We'll see
30
this
boats.
next year and check for our
You
emails.
take separate. Pretty much. No, you would